All right. Well, hello. Thank-
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for talking with me today. It's a total pleasure and a joy and an honor. And I just want to start off by congratulating you on this complete tour de force achievement. I'm just going to keep flipping the book over back and forth. This is totally virtuosic and formidable, epic poem in two languages.
Thank
You
you.
know, this is epics are infrequent events, especially today, and to have one in two languages and of this size is really extraordinary. I mean, you've published, I hope I get this right, six poetry collections and like 10 books of translation and self-translation, something
I've
like
published, um, so there's supposed to be a La Bella Crisis, which is my first
that.
collection only in Spanish in a very long time. It's supposed to come out this year.
Yeah.
So that would be my seventh, and this would be my eighth. Or
Hmm.
this would be my seventh, and that would be my eighth. So before all of this year, six.
Yeah, okay. You're extremely prolific. And this is kind of, I mean, I know you've got more things to say, but like this is kind of a magnum opus. Like this is like 400 pages. Um, and I like I want to just ask you kind of an open-ended question of like, how did you come to write an epic poem?
Wow. Honestly, I think like answering it, I'd have to answer it in parts. I definitely remember being a teenager and thinking, I want to write an epic at some point in my life, and it's going to be the history of Puerto Rico. And and I had characters even at that young age when I didn't identify as trans that were going to shapeshift. I remember
Mhm.
that very clearly. And I
Mhm.
remember wanting it to be like sci-fi or speculative.
Yeah.
And that was really exciting. And I remember reading when I was young epic poetry that I really loved. Like, the Metamorphosis isn't exactly, I mean, it gets called an epic in a sense, but not really. It's like a compendium of sorts, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but that was very influential, as was the
Yeah.
Odyssey,
Yeah.
as was the Iliad, as was the Popol Vuh, as were like all these books that came to me mostly in translation.
Hmm.
And it's the University of Puerto Rico is funny in a way, like every colonized place, there's a long history of worshiping the colonizers in a sense. And so there was a very traditional, yeah, I tend to think that sometimes people in colonized countries know the classics of the colonizing country more than than people you know
Aha.
from
Yeah.
those places, at least in terms of
Yeah.
formal education. And there was a little bit of that here, like at the University of Puerto Rico, at least, they used to have a marathon where they would read the Odyssey or the Iliad, I think, like in front of generales for like a whole day, and then everyone would just like, be reading it all day.
Yeah. That's
um,
wild.
it is wild. And I remember that very clearly and thinking it was kind of silly and kind of cool at the same time, because
Mm.
you have to really be like such a like literature geek, right? Or like something like to like really get that into it. It's
And
like,
people showed up for it.
oh yeah, people always
Yeah.
showed up for it. It was always kind of like a group. But even the fact that there was a group, and that it was an event, and that it was
Yeah.
recurring event, was really impressive.
Hmm.
But I think it had to do with the fact that there just was really generally a public culture
Yeah.
at the university of like, we're here, we're doing literature, we're doing art, and a lot of the privatization of the university has um, led to that being less so,
Mm.
but not gone, not definitely not gone.
That just reminds me of the opening scene on the very first page of your book, where people are invited in to gather under the ceiba tree, right? And kind of made welcome as the story and the song is going to unfurl.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
that's a good way of thinking of it. Definitely is that moment when they're like in front of the rampa. If you ever been to Generales and La Yupi, like definitely that's where people read. So it's a very public event.
Mhm.
And it, like whenever I read about epics, it was always like that, right? It was an
Yeah.
oral event. It was not like the written form came later, right? The oral
Mhm.
came first, and the repetition and everything was always as a memory and mnemonic device, right? To like be able
Right.
to like memorize this very, very long story and be able
Yeah.
to tell it. And each iteration would be different, so that's how I learned that epics
Mhm.
were.
Yeah.
And of course, like I knew that they were associated to the nation with the nation building and the idea of nation and national formation.
Mhm.
And that opening scene, I also really envisioned the like Seba in front of my grandmother's house, my maternal grandmother's house. Is
Yeah.
a hill of Miradero, and there's a Seba. Like kind of where we park the car is right next to the house, near the Marquesina. And cebas are really kind of prickly trees, actually. They have these very intense spines that are part of the wood in the trunk, but not like the base, just a little further up along the trunk. They're very spiky, but the
Hmm.
base, the roots are above ground and they're gigantic, and they kind of create the shape where you could sit in the base of a ceiba and like
Mhm.
tell a tale.
Mhm.
So I imagine that space and the animals there and everything there. Yeah, kind of like a picnic.
I love I love that. I love knowing that there's like a specific tree for you too, that this is rooted in, pun intended. Um, yeah, and and you talk about the in the poem, it's um Canción Nueva, it's a new song, right? And it's a epic, it's very Puerto Rican, it's bilingual, it's trans, it's carving out this space and also calling something into being, right? I think of um the poem is summoning or making something manifest, like it's a form of conjuration maybe in that space. S- I mean, you're talking about how you thought from a young age you might want to write an epic poem, and then also you were thinking about this tradition of epics and sort of very old epics, but then you wanted to carve out a new song, right? So like moving away from those ancient epics. Um, and I just wonder, like, what was it that you wanted to call into being through writing this? Or maybe it was a different kind of experience of writing it.
Definitely, as I was starting the more physical aspects of my transitional, it's hard to know, like draw that line sometimes because cutting your hair is physical,
Mm,
those were definitely things that I started before I started tea. But I will say, when I started tea and I started thinking about things like top surgery and all of this was after I moved back to Puerto Rico, uh,
mhm,
about 5.5 years ago, right? So I moved back to Puerto Rico, and in that moving back and like being back home, the hardness of moving back, but also settling into the idea that there's no more moving after this point, right? There's no going anywhere. um it really kind of, it came with a lot of really hard truths about home, right? Because it's different when you're far away and you have the luxury of romanticizing, even if it's hard. You remember the things. I'd lost friends to hate crimes while I was in the diaspora. I don't didn't I never had a romantic notion of what it was to be here. But distance allows you kind of a space, a kind of a space to romanticize, certainly. And so being back home and dealing with transphobia back home, even though I never never felt the impulse to go back to the US, certainly
mhm,
wasn't easy. It was very hard, and it came with rejection, and it came with um at times rejection from my own community and people in my own community, and that sense of like really kind of feeling a complicated relationship to notions of community, even as it is my community and even as it is my home. it's definitely not unique. I think that most people have felt that at some point, but it's definitely in my case tied to my gender expression and
Mhm.
to being trans. And so, I really wanted to leave a space for this idea, especially for colonized peoples, because in Puerto Rico, because we've never had an independent nation, even though we have a sense of ourselves as having a national identity, very
Yeah.
complicated sense, but it's
Yeah.
there. Um, even as we form national canons, even as we form literary national canons and all of this, um, it definitely felt like there were people who even within the left, they were there was a willingness to sacrifice in that formation, and those people were the queer people, and those people were honestly like there was also just like other identity formations that were overlooked, though not necessarily excluded. But I
Mm.
wanted to talk about mine, right? Not about those other identities, because that's not mine too. That's not my song. And so, of course, literature has always been a place where I feel I can be most myself.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and where I feel freest.
Yeah.
And at the same time, to find that in all of these archives I was researching as part of the Puerto Rican Literature Project when I worked on it for about 2.5 years,
Yeah.
La Colección Puertorriqueña to the Institute of Puerto Rican Cultural's General Archive to like just oral archives, not finding published, openly trans published poets before the 21st century was devastating, because it
Mm.
like this thing that where I most feel at home is where I am not allowed to really be trans.
Mm.
Um, and so, obviously there have been many a new generation with the 21st century that has changed a lot of that, but
Yeah.
not this fundamental exclusionary structures.
Yeah.
Mm. And so, what happened was that I wanted, I said, this is something I tell my students to say, what are the repositories of memory, um, in educational institutions, schools, universities, um, religious institutions, the church,
Mhm.
um, private legal institutions like the family, and all of those are spaces. Or if you're leftist, like me, the party, right? And so all of these places where or the political organization where I learned from older activists, where I took in those memories, and all of those places were places that were trans exclusionary.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you have from one generation to the next an incredible amount of loss in terms of memory.
Mm.
Question for me became, when looking into what felt like an abyss and a lack of continuity, where are my trans elders beyond like a generation back, right?
Mhm.
I trace a lineage? Can I trace a lineage within this framework of the nation? And the answer was no, and so yes and no. There are traces, right? There
Yeah.
are remnants, but not in
Yeah.
that way, not in that continuous way. And so what do people do when that happens? They make it up, right? What have we historically done when we're excluded or left out of literature? Those of us who come to literature from positions of marginality, if you want to give it a name, is we write ourselves into literature, right? We write our own histories, we write our own literatures. And for me, that meant ironizing, much like I had done with Lo Terciario, form, a form, which is the form of national formation,
Mhm.
of which is the epic. But also, honestly, I'm very deconstructivist. So, of course, my move is to be like, but was the epic really just about national formation? And that meant going back to epics and realizing that they were never coherent projects. They were never the coherent projects. They were presented as, just as the Bible was a compendium, right? The versions of epics that come to us through written literature are also often shaped by the people who use them for their own aims.
Yeah.
Even though oral traditions that gave birth to them were much richer and more complicated and, you know, definitely not as coherent as they're presented. And so, rereading the Odyssey, why is there like so much attention to metaphor? Like there's not a particular reason for that, right? There's joy there, and there are all kinds of things that happen there that don't fit into the narrative of Odysseus, uh,
Hmm.
that are actually about aesthetics and pleasure and poetry and something happening beyond just the thing being narrated. Um, and that sort of break with that narrative structure, which I would say are not that different from Bakhtin's notion of polyglossia or heteroglossia.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so I also wanted to answer formally Bakhtin's claim that the novel could have polyglossia and the poetry couldn't.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Real true to me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That's such a rich answer, and I have like 18 different directions I want to go in to follow up. I- Um, yeah, it's really striking the kind of just the density of reference in this book. And also I'm thinking polyvocality as being so important to it. Poly everything is important to this book. But you have a chorus that chimes in along with the narrator. And you have references to epics in different languages and long poems in different languages, right? Like everything from Dante to these like mid 19th century epics from Spaniards to right to Puerto Rican literature to the Conference of the Birds. I mean, it's really
Clueless,
what's that?
to the movie Clueless.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that right, exactly. Yeah, and like songs by Bad Bunny and Daddy Yankee. I mean, you've got like this like wide tapestry and um I guess I want to ask like which were the authors of the books that you felt like really kept you company through the process of writing it? Like which helped like light the way? Because there's different ways of interacting with different works, right? But like what were the ones that were for you, the ones that kind of fueled your fire and
Well, about the chorus, I want to say that, the Greek chorus is usually, a stand-in for like audience participation in a sense, right? It has this intermediate position. It allows there to
Mhm,
be kind of a public space that responds and questions and interrogates. It's somewhere between an authorial voice, right, and a sort of like general public, as
mhm.
imagined by the author.
Yeah.
Um, but in the case of my chorus, I wanted the chorus to have real people, which is what happens in the final canto, right? I wanted to define these voices as coming together to form a chorus, but also being rooted in particular experiences.
Mhm,
Um, in terms of texts that accompany me, definitely the Conference of the Birds. In fact, Faridun Dinatar, I'm probably saying it, mangling that word, but it's coming to me through translation. Um, is in real life he was a pharmacist, right? Boticario, as well as a poet, and he is the pharmacist in my text, but of course he's not, um it's not faithful, right? It's not a faithful
yeah.
rendition of this historical figure because it's a different world, it's an alternate world.
Mhm, mhm,
But he is the pharmacist that of course gives a very important medication to Sinex, right, in the third canto. And definitely Simurg, which is the conference, right, of the, it's the place toward, it's the bird that flies over all the other birds in the epic in Faridun
mhm.
Qatar's epic,
Yeah.
um which is a representative of a, a version of what we would call God, right? A unity of the 30 birds themselves, right?
Mm.
Becomes the camp of the 30 birds at the end. It becomes kind of like a camp on the outskirts of Algarabia city where Sinex is towards which Sinex is traveling without knowing he's traveling
Yeah.
towards that destination until the end of third canto. And it's
Mhm.
Harry that tells him that. And there's all kinds of personal jokes there too, because Farid Matuk was one of the first people who trusted me a lot, trusted this work I had first read to him, and kind of encouraged me to keep writing it. So there's an echo there of my
I
friend.
love that. That's nice. Yeah.
um, but yeah, definitely like the bird becomes this physical place in Algarabia, a kind of like reminiscent of spaces, queer spaces that have been very important for me as a trans person in Puerto Rico. And where Sinex learns certain things from other trans people that he wouldn't learn elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the Odyssey was certainly important to me.
Mm.
Um, I think of it's one of my favorite epics, mostly because it has so much going on that it
Yeah.
doesn't on this, I guess like a surface reading doesn't quite catch. And it's actually very fantastical, and it's very much about returning home. So of course, as someone who was writing about returning home, this made sense.
Yeah.
And the metamorphosis, but of course, Ovid's metamorphosis is the first thing that Senex disavows, right, in the first canto, right? He says, "This is the story I was given of my birth," because Senex's name comes from Caeneus and the story of Caeneus and the metamorphosis, but I've changed it and it's different, right? And so essentially, Senex is singing, these bards, I've inherited these stories, my story told to me in other voices, and I
Mm.
recognize it. I don't have a memory of this ever having happened. Um, and so I realize this is official history, right? The
Mm.
version of this coming to me has already been filtered and changed and altered. It's not my story, it's not my song. And so in
Mhm.
order to sing my song, I must return to these memories with the help of the muse. The true memories, right? Not the metamorphosis of Ovid's metamorphosis, but my version of it, and sing this song. And part of it is because, it was one of the first trans characters I came across in literature was Caeneus. But
Mm.
cis and trans were definitely not categories that were operating in that way for
Yeah.
Ovid. But definitely the way Ovid was presented to me was cis. And so, the stakes of always having our story told by others that are, and there are many trans characters in Puerto Rican literature, and yet no one thought to ask us, how we felt about that. And
Mm.
so, from Willy Colon's, El Gran Barón, to like Alejandro Tapia Rivera's Póstumo El Transmigrado, which is at some point Póstumo El Invirginado,
Mm.
he exists as characters or as symbols or as, ideas or notions, but then when we actually exist physically in the world, we're killed or we're ridiculed. And so that really brought home this idea that it was important for me to sing Senexa's song, not Ovid's.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, I again, I want to ask you in four different directions, but one is, you did a lot of archival work for the Puerto Rican Literature Project for a number of years, and I could tell from the notes to Algarabia that that was feeding your brain and your imagination and present with you. Some of the works that you found where maybe gender wasn't clear, or it was, there's sort of like trans question mark in the margins of some of these authors' work. Um, did you, how did you, what was the process like for you? Were you writing the epic while you were working on the project? Was it what was that like for you in terms of the way that those texts entered and
I was being, being really exploited in terms of my labor in many senses, and yet doing something I deeply loved. And so it's very contradictory for me, right? Position to be in, because I felt like I was carrying a lot of work. I was doing a lot of work. I never stopped. It was like constant. And it was work with literature, which I loved. So I felt grateful. And there's this notion of like, oh, you should be grateful. You get to do what you love, and it's true, but that doesn't change the fact that I was working way too much. And so, there was a fundamental kind of question of labor for me, about my own labor and the precarity of my position as a trans person. Like, what job could I actually get outside of this project? There are not enough jobs, tenure track jobs in the University of Puerto Rico, which is where I wanted to teach. There's just not enough alternatives. I can keep translating, but that's not a sustainable thing for
yeah.
me, in terms of like it is, but it's still like whenever the jobs come kind of thing. So it just was like, really hitting home that I had come back to a colony where there was already a scarcity of work,
Mhm.
that I was a trans person, that like people could see I'm a trans person, that was going to limit my job opportunities.
Mm.
And so as I'm doing all this reading and research, mostly of around cis writers, it's really just like so stark to me what's happening in terms of my own experience and my own transition, and starting to take tea. And
Mhm.
so really initially the epic, I had just finished on this case as well, and published it during my work on this archive. I was very grateful it was out there, and I did what I wanted to do with that. Um, and the kind of what's next question, people ask me that question, and I really have never felt driven by those questions, because I just think what's next is what comes next. You can't dictate when a book comes or when an idea comes. But I definitely at some point was like, yeah, my next project is going to take me like 10 years, and it's going to be this epic. It did
And you
not
wrote
take me.
it so fast.
It's kind of unhealthy how fast I wrote it, in a
What was
sense,
it, two
but
years? 3 years?
like three
Three.
years.
Yeah.
Definitely there was at least 6 months there where I took a huge risk, and I wasn't working on anything except this, which was after I left the project. I was just working on this. And
Yeah.
it was after I finished the first draft, and then I started rewriting, and I was like, I have no idea how I even did that, honestly. It was so like, you know, ridiculous as it may sound, like I had this kind of notion of the way that Gabriel Garcia Marquez had written Cien Años de Soledad. But of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez depended on his wife's work, and a lot of her unpaid labor to do that. And my partner was not going to do that, and I wasn't going to ask him to do that. He had a full-time job. So it was really just me with my own brain and the things I had been writing, and just coming back to it, and just piles of papers on my bed in our room. And, Tito being very patient as I dealt with this, and Tessa also being very patient and reading the material, and just my friends being very generous about it. And people would talk to me, and I'd be like, when I'm done with the epic, we can hang out. When I'm done with, I'm not done. I have this timeline, and it just
Yeah.
felt so like I don't love that part, but it was also a momentum. I did love that part. I'm not gonna lie. Like,
Yeah. You must have had momentum to write it that fast.
momentum, and it just, well, and a lot, it's just really, because momentum makes it sound like it was all this this free kind of, no, it was editing. It was like intense, like
Yeah.
just and a kind of editing, because I think editing for me as a poet, I don't know how other people do this, right? But for me, when I edit, I am doing creative work.
Oh, yeah.
I'm rewriting. And so the part of my brain that's a poet is working while I'm editing, which is why I've never understood how people who aren't poets edit poetry. I've never quite comprehended that because I'm like, no, it's actually creative work when you edit poetry.
Totally.
So all this to say that, what's your question, Rachel?
Oh, it's good. It's good. I was asking what your process was like. I mean, I could tell from the drafts that I saw, like you were making like radical change, rewriting, taking things out, rewriting, and with each edit, you're like, oh, I made a few changes. Like there's like a whole new section here. That was really. What was it like for you working? Like, I'm curious about writing in Spanish and writing in English, right? Were you working on them simultaneously? Did you do a section and then write it in the other language and then flip again? Like, what was the process like?
Couldn't tell you because I know it was definitely not unlike other processes I'd had. Usually I write in Spanish and I translate into English. This was something else. This was,
Uh-huh.
I don't know which side I wrote first. There were parts I wrote first in English, I think, parts I wrote in Spanish, mostly
Yeah.
at first. And it's just it just all it I don't want to say influence because that's not the word, but it all just kind of like fed each other in this way and like just
Yeah.
it was not a clear cut thing,
Hmm. Hmm.
um
Hmm.
pause 1 second.
Sure.
Could you pause the interview 1 second? Would you
Yep.
mind doing that?
Not at all. Let's see. Okay. Um, so we're back after that brief break from our sponsors. So you have this wonderful note on nomenclature and style at the end of the book. And you kind of talk about the relationship between the Spanish and the English versions. I kind of want to call it two books, like twin books or something, like as opposed to being translations of each other, maybe. And you talk about it engaging misunderstanding just as much as it engages with identity formation and transformation. And that caught my attention because obviously, like throughout the book, there are plenty of terms that are in Spanish that you don't translate into English, or you do something else with them in English, or the lines go in a different direction. And so there's a real kind of like lack of interest in creating two versions that have a one-to-one parallel, right? It's like two different lives within the same book in some way. Um, so I just wanted to ask you about that and, what your kind of your goals were and why you set about. I mean, we've talked about this in the past, but in terms of this book, why was that important to you?
So the title is a word that gets translated as like ruckus or like I've heard hullabaloo, which is like the closest, I
I
guess.
love it.
Hate the word hullabaloo.
Oh no, it's so good. It's so good. It's an Irish word.
Oh, but I like it better. But definitely like in Puerto Rico, algarabía is like it's usually associated with festivity,
Mhm.
like overlapping voices, but like kind of a mess noise wise, but also a celebratory kind of, not always.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's negative, right? Like se formó una algarabía is like this, se formó esto, this whole thing. But then the origin was really what led me to decide that this was the word, because it
Mm.
first time it appears in Romance, de Mora Moraima, which is this figure of una mora, right? This Moorish woman during the Crusades.
Mhm.
And it's in El Romancero General, and it's, I think, one of the only ones that's actually written about a Moorish woman. And this Christian comes to her door, speaking to her in Algarabía, como aquel que bien la sabe, as if he knows it, as if he knows this language. Um, because Algarabía is actually Al Arabia, which is Arabic.
Uh-huh.
And so when it comes into Spanish, it comes through this word, um, and this word becomes synonymous with being incomprehensible, right? Whether it be through festivity or through noise, that which is incomprehensible. And of course, Karina Albayeshorsky and all kinds of people have written beautiful essays about sound and excess and, like Latinidad. But, for me, I mean, definitely we could talk about boceteo and the concept of boceteo and how the state here has like tried to control it, which is
Uh-huh.
like playing reggaeton really loud on your speakers as like you drive by, right? Um,
Mhm.
we can talk about political campaigns here and like kind of the presence of noise. We can talk about how that, is associated with Caribbeanness and Blackness. But really, like for me, what was important was the fact that this word that is the name of an entire language
Mhm.
essentially becomes synonymous with that which is incomprehensible in
Yeah.
another language. And so it was really important for me, because it's how I feel as a trans person, right? Like my entire world is rendered incomprehensible
Mhm.
outside of other trans people.
Mhm.
In the world outside of this proximity, in this world that trans
Mhm.
people create every day together, we are incomprehensible. We rendered incomprehensible, whether it be our gender, whether it be our forms of expression or ways of being. And yet in our world, it is a world, right? Like in the ballroom or in whatever spaces we create, whether it be sharing um information on hormones or whatever, just spending time together being trans, right? That world that we create is rendered utterly incomprehensible in this other language. And so that inspired the idea that Algarabia was a planet. Also very inspired by the novel Stars in My Pocket, Like Grains of Sand, Samuel Delaney's novel, which the main character, Rat Korga, at the beginning of the novel, his world is destroyed and he's the sole survivor. And so he
Mhm.
now has to navigate this universe, being the sole survivor of a genocide of an entire planet. And that sort of
Mhm.
uh, Chip Delaney does a really great job of trying to describe what it is, how the impossibility of actually being able to describe losing an entire world,
Mhm.
Um, and for Chip, it's also like his way of describing losing a loved one, which he in the book is I think the ideal object of desire rather than a soulmate, right? He moves away from that language, the
Mhm.
Christian language. And, that's sort of like totalizing
Mhm.
devastation that's impossible to actually render or describe. And so it was really important for me when imagining Algarabia, Algarabia is a stand-in for that that epic loss, right? That abysmal loss, staring into the archives, staring into written records and
Yeah.
past, knowing we are written out of it over and over, and yet that we have existed despite that. What trans people go through every day, all the time, is existing despite a continual effort to erase us.
Mhm.
It comes from colonial systems of power, white supremacist systems of power, that have imposed a very binary idea of the world.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, you know, when I worked with the translation, and the notion of this as translation, I took something that I had done in other works before, right? But I just expanded it
Yeah.
and I explored it more,
Yeah.
which is, you know, yes, it's transcreation. Of course, I really love, um, in all sincerity, I love the term transcreation. I love the way translators talk about things. But the sometimes when I hear these terms, I kind of laugh to myself because I'm a trans person. And so I really can't imagine, it's hard for me to fathom the way people who aren't trans think of radical change in language and in self, because it's so small in comparison to what transitioning it is. It's so like,
Mhm.
I feel like cis people think it's really a big deal, and it is, but it's never as big a deal as literally changing everything about your body and gender. Like, and
Mhm.
that's not, even if it's not physically visible, even if you're a non-binary person, you're just working out your transness internally, it's still like a transformation of a world for another, right? And that comes with loss.
Mm.
And as a colonized subject as well, I'm always surprised by how conservative I actually find most people who say that they work in transcreation in terms of the choices they make, versus the language, which sounds so cool and radical. And I think it's something that happens in general in academia, right? Like
Mm.
when words are they're supposed to convey something really significant and different from what has come before, because people are essentially trying to leave their mark within a field. And so
Mm.
what you do when you do that, you say, this is the newest, coolest thing
Yeah.
that no one has ever done
Yeah.
before. And
Yeah.
so I think that, I'm an academic, and it's not to say that that has no value, right? But I definitely, there's a part of me that will never really fit into academia for a variety of reasons. There are parts of me that don't fit within that world. And so those parts of me snicker, when I hear these words, because I'm like, when someone says a revolutionary use of this word, and
Yeah,
I'm, is
yeah,
that revolutionary? And
yeah.
it's not to say it can't be important, right? But, you know, like everyone else, academics are prone to exaggeration. Perhaps the difference is that they don't believe they are. Um,
No.
you know,
No.
see a telenovela, I know I'm getting exaggeration, but if I read an article, I'm supposed to be getting truth. And so I would rather, I think I prefer the telenovela because it's very upfront about what it's doing, right?
That's amazing. I love that. Well, and I think too, in your introduction to the Shenandoah feature a couple of years ago of trans poets, called The Trans Heat Is Here, I think that's right. And you have you talk about your own translation of, I think, Alejandra Rosa's work. Maybe it was somebody else, and you call it a trans translation, which is your term, right? Like that's, and you could call it revolutionary or not, but like, and you don't define it in the essay, but you present what I would call like a creative, good translation, right? Like an exciting translation, and you call it a trans translation.
Well, it's a trans translation because I'm trans and I'm translating another trans person.
Mhm. Yeah,
So already that's
yeah.
that's a very trans
You're putting
translation.
the trans
I
back
mean,
into
yeah, I
transcreation.
mean, how many, there are trans people doing that now, definitely, and I'm
Yeah.
excited about it. But there's, I think in general, there's a lack of trans people in some fields. Let's
Mhm.
put it like that, right? And translation is a really amazing, well, if I'm gonna theorize it, I would say, you know, um, just as a translator has been historically invisibilized and this
Yeah.
plays a mediating role that is often a curational role, right?
Hmm.
Written as transparency or as a conduit. And in that invisibilization, the structures of power that go into translation are invisibilized,
Hmm. Hmm.
which I agree with, fundamentally. Um, so are a million other parts of, right, like academics, thinkers, cultural workers, identities in the choices they make, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
people being cis
Hmm.
or people being from the US translating people from the global south.
Yeah.
Those are also invisibilized uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
aspects of translators' identities.
Hmm.
And they play a role, right? And they and I'd say more than playing a role, right? Sometimes we think of it like a translator with the text and we can like trace that relationship.
Yeah.
A major role in terms of who gets seen as a translator, right? And who gets legitimized. I mean, there's so many translators in Latin America. They're incredible translators that people in the US, just the translators in the US don't even know about and don't care to know about, right? Because the the machinery of a kind of translation industry prioritizes English, right? And prioritizes
Yeah.
um quote unquote native English speakers,
Mm.
and so there's something there that's structural, and I'm not blaming any particular person, right? I'm just saying this is something I've noticed as
Yeah.
someone who knows many translators here that are doing work that feel very invisibilized and like they're
Hmm.
not being recognized. And because it's not, some of it isn't English and some of it isn't, but because they're essentially not tapped into certain circles and networks in the United States. And that is not new and or exclusive to translation, right? That goes, the same goes for publishing in general, the same goes for all of these, right,
Yep.
systems. And my experience is that, when the people checking your work and giving you feedback all look and sound and are like you and mirror you, and the people you're translating don't, you're gonna miss a lot.
Mm.
And there's a lot that's gonna get not checked. And it's
Yeah.
not gonna get, it's gonna get some of it's gonna just be straight up inaccurate, right? Like, because you don't have anyone verifying that, you're depending on a division of labor that's already so loaded.
Hmm.
Um, and that's my general complaint. But if I were to theorize translation, I would say, um, when I say trans, I mean embodied, in a variety of ways,
Mm.
embodied. And so to translate in a trans way is to think of form and content as inseparable, as the form is a kind of content, which is my own practice in general. I'm not certainly not the first person to say this, and to think of the ways in which um like think of the stakes of translating a text, thinking of what it means or the dangers even of translating a text, right?
Mhm.
In a context where so many settler colonizers are moving to Puerto Rico and displacing us and literally exterminating us through what in the US would be called gentrification, but here is, this is a country, um, it becomes a really loaded thing to think of translation as abstract when it in fact could play a role. Like there
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
are interpreters here that are helping people buy property, and property belongs to Puerto Ricans, and put it in the hands of US tax evaders that are coming here
Mhm.
and displacing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not neutral, that's
Right.
not a neutral thing. um so yeah, for me, definitely, like, it's also a joke, right? Like, I'm trans and I'm a translator. There's an evident pun there, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
how
Yeah.
could I possibly avoid the pun,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere else. I was like, I put the trans in translation, like it's
Yeah. It trans back into trans creation
yeah,
too. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
of course
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. But I
it's
hear what you're saying about the embodied nature. I feel like, like a theme that's sort of arising as we're talking, which seems to me so important for your book, for Algarabia, is like this idea of embodied language and language as embodiment, and that these things are not separate. And it's like a non-dual vision of that that's really powerful in your book. And you were talking about Bakhtin earlier and kind of polyvocality and kind of pushing back on the idea that only the novel can offer that, and having more than one language in Algarabia, but also you have so many different kinds of languages, kinds of Spanishes, kinds of Englishes, right? From like elevated citations to contemporary slang or idiomatic expressions, or, it's just like a total range of registers and also a range of poetic forms. So you've got decimas and sonnets and pantoums. And you're doing things like concrete things on the page, and working with typography and images. So there's so many different registers in which this book is kind of singing its song, in a sense.
absolutely. I just maybe I learned this from C.A. Conrad. C.A. Conrad does, they do this work on the page that isn't exactly concrete poetry, really. Like the
Mm,
somatic rituals they don't follow a form in a rationalist sense, right?
yeah.
They have a form that CA feels, and senses and experiences as the right form for the poem, as the
Yeah.
form that the poem has chosen and taken. So that's something different from just like writing a sonnet and following this, like,
Yeah, yeah,
like, which I do, and
yeah.
I enjoy, and it's part of my practice. It's great,
Mm,
but I definitely draw from that practice.
mhm.
That isn't just CA, right? I think a lot of vanguardist experimental work relies on something which, we can call intuition, or we can call just like feeling the poem, or what the poem dictate, whatever we want to call
Yeah.
it, right? But it's just the idea that something is going on that isn't mappable or explainable or analyzable.
Mhm.
And maybe some of that is like just very mappable, you know. Like, I don't want to over romanticize it, right? Because we're all still a product of our contexts and our intersections. But I still think something goes on that, whether it be the unconscious or whatever, is just we're saying before we even fully, like we're
Mhm.
making the language where there wasn't a language, because I think it is
Yeah.
that the vision, right? There are definitely poetic lineages that see language as a form of control,
Mm,
dominance, and colonization, right? The
yeah.
form contains, the form controls, the form shapes, the form, even the languages that we use, it gives it
Mhm.
direction, it defines these limits, it moves the reader in these ways, it directs the read. This is all very controlling language,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and then there's another kind in lineage. This is sort of like, I'm closer to, perhaps, even though I'm also wary of, which is like, the poetry does this free thing and it doesn't have this form, right?
Mm,
Because I get it's, we do internalize forms. And so something that seems free can also be very structured, right? Because we may have learned all of these forms. Uh, Um, but I think that poets do something, like poets that I love and admire do something kind of like a soul work or something else.
mm,
They're working through a problem with a part of the self that uh maybe is a poetic organ or a region of the brain that deals with this. I don't know. It taps into something else, and it is world making, and I can't
mhm.
why I don't have, if I had the language for what that is, right? I wouldn't write poetry. I think the poetry is the language for what that is.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think it's a recognition that our experience, the language is shapes and is a huge part of our experience, but that it isn't all of our experience, and that we still, because our experience is ever moving and changing and transforming, the language is too, right? And it just,
Mm,
we have new experiences, and we are figuring out a language for those new experiences, and we're trying to constantly not trap or encapsulate, but do something with language in relation to, or like through that experience, or add to that experience with the language. And
mhm,
that's going to look really different, and sometimes we're going to feel like we weren't able to, or we were close but we couldn't, and sometimes it's going to feel like we did, right? And it's often going to have replicas and echoes that deviate from whatever that was for us. But I think that's what poetry work is, and I don't think it's something that we're ever really going to be able to summarize.
mhm, mhm,
And I think translation does that too,
mm,
and
mm,
I don't I don't feel mechanical about translation. I think there are mechanical aspects of translation, right?
mhm,
There are fact checking and there are things we can do, but
mm,
that in and of itself is not the translation. Just as I do research for poetry, but the research isn't the poem, right?
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Two thoughts. So like what you're saying about languages is this is really powerful. I'm kind of chewing this over as you're talking, and I'm thinking about all of the work that's done in Algarabia around naming and pronouns, right? And the idea of the dead name being canceled, and like Julia, who's not Julia de Burgos. And there's just like a constant play, and with nicknames. And it's so interesting because on the one hand, it kind of connects to like the epic tradition of maintaining names and epithets and so forth, and that being a kind of like structural component of an epic. But on the other hand, it seems like such a like specifically like trans centric kind of cluster of concerns around naming and pronouns and finding the name and the pronoun that fit you. Um, and so in some ways, you're doing this work on the level of register and in poetic form, but also just like on nouns and pronouns, like on this like small level of, right, like essential poetic work.
Yeah, I think that in my, for me, how I feel about that is I don't trust a poet that sees pronouns as a limitation,
Mm,
because that's the way they think of language.
mm,
They see it only as something limited and finite. And I don't think good poetry comes out of that
mm,
idea and vision of the world.
mm.
Um, I know it's quite a thing to say good poetry, right?
I know.
The fuck is good poetry?
Yeah.
But maybe a better way of putting it is that in my view, only bad poetry can come from an idea of language that is the bare minimum. And I think
Mm,
that to believe and stop at the idea that we cannot change a pronoun is the most boring and uninteresting and unpoetic and anti-intellectual position someone can take, and I'm just not interested in it, right? Generally. But that's as a poet, right? As a person navigating the world, that doesn't mean that there aren't wonderful people who think like that, right? In fact, I would say that a lot of the world thinks like that. And that's the way we've been socialized to think about language,
mm,
right?
mm.
As,
Yeah.
as if it weren't a constantly changing thing that we are making.
Right.
And it's very
Right.
disempowering idea of language,
Yeah.
right? Because it means that we
Yeah.
can't change it, even though we are changing it as we speak it and as we engage with it. And I think it is part of nationalist projects and extermination and genocidal
Yeah.
projects in this idea of language for a
Yeah.
very long time. It's the
Yep.
way that languages die. And I refer to Jasnaya Aguilar Hill, who says it way better than I do or ever could, right? In terms of like that colonial history of official languages and standardization,
Uh-huh.
kind of language reproduction of the standardization of language through
Yeah.
institutionality and
Yep.
state sponsorship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
Um,
And you and I have talked about, language change, and we both have an interest in sociolinguistics. And like the core assumption now anyway is that languages change all the time, right? And that
yeah,
people change it. It's like this is just like the point of departure for the um I think could I ask you like three more questions? Oh,
you
keep it
can ask me anything you want. Yeah.
okay. I mean, I really do want to just talk to you for hours, but I hope this is a first installment of this particular conversation. So you mentioned research a minute ago, like research is not the same as writing poetry. So yeah, but that made me think of the extraordinary story that you tell from Fray Pané, the 15th century Spanish friar, right, who supposedly is the first European to publish in the Americas, and he's taking stories from the Taino people, right? And has this extraordinary tale of like the creation of gender that you retell in your book so powerfully in the first canto. Can you like how did you come across that story? I mean, you turn it into this um sort of like origin tale in your book. It seems like a real kind of hot point in the whole epic to me. How did you come across it? What was your engagement with this story?
You mean in the dream realm where I'm smoking weed with, what's the next is smoking weed with Carl Sagan and Titi Hicks?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time I read it, I didn't realize what it was actually, and that's part of why I chose it, because I think I had to go through changes in order to be able to read it. And the way
Ah,
it was taught to me, I didn't really realize what it was until many years later. And it was another trans person that pointed it out to me, that I had to revisit the text. And even though I read it at the university and everything, it just did not, or maybe it did register, but I certainly didn't remember it. Um and it was very important to me because it is a translation that is
mhm.
the only record we have of this particular myth. Um, it means that there were translators that are unnamed, Taino translators that we will not know, because
Yes.
Ane went to learn the Taino language in 3 years, which I don't think anyone I know learns a language in 3 years. Um, and with all kinds of physical impediments, right? Because he was a colonizer arriving to this place where he was to not have familiarity with the plants or anything.
Yeah.
God knows what was lost there, right? But certainly something entered that translation that hadn't been there in the Bible, for example, which is these eel-like beings that have neither the parts of men nor women, according to the transcription and translation of Faipane. That then the men who aren't, the women have left the island, are the island's not Puerto Rico, but yeah, the women have left, and the men want to have sex and they're horny, and so they tie these eel-like beings around the neck of this carpet woodpecker, and the woodpecker drills holes into their bodies because it's confused, and then they fuck these holes, right? This is an incredible story. And what's interesting to me is that the ways in which I've seen it described over and over is the creation of woman.
Aha. Right.
But there were already women because they
Right.
left
Right.
and they went to a different island. And so it's not the creation of woman, it's the first bottom surgery, right? But of course it's an involuntary bottom surgery.
Yeah.
I don't Nobody consulted the eel-like beings if they
No.
wanted bottom surgery, right?
It's a
Um,
bit violent. It's
it's
violent.
violent, and
Yeah.
it's the institution of a binary,
Right.
right? Yeah,
Right.
well, or binary enough to have sex, right? And without necessarily the aim of reproduction. There's no mention of reproduction, right?
Mhm.
It is this bottom surgery of these non-binary eel-like beings that are undefined in order for the men to have sexual satisfaction. Um, and I was fascinated by it, obviously. It was weird as fuck. Like it was amazing. I loved it. Um, and also because it is a constitutive violence, right? But it's one that even in that rendition is so strange and so impossible to really grasp what is
Yeah.
said. And I think that for me, the idea that even in that moment of constituting a binary, there is confusion and lack of clarity, and kind of there's the kind of trying to work around language as it is structured to define these beings
Yeah.
without really consulting how they define themselves,
Yeah.
um is fascinating to me. And it was certainly indicative, if anything, that there were non-binary beings
Yeah.
before colonization,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they
It
were foundational.
extraordinary. It's like extraordinary. Your retelling of it is amazing, and the way that you weave it into the narrative. Um it's really wild. So you read that first in school and university. You read that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm. As
Mhm.
an early account.
I
Yeah.
mean, I read it like it's it's you can read it in the translation that's there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, there was all kinds of things in the text that were like, not usual to my world. So I probably just flew under the radar. Or honestly, probably my notion of the binary was already pretty flexible. I mean,
Mhm.
the first time I went to a gay bar, I was in San Francisco visiting when I was 14. And I have a very clear memory. I was just fascinated, it was like it was a dyke party, all these women, but the person I fixated on was a transmasculine person that I didn't have the language for that. And I went in with a fake ID. My mother was very concerned, that this had happened. But a friend encouraged me to approach this transmasculine person and ask them to dance. And I was very femme presenting. And I did. I was, and then I remember identifying as bi, and it was kind of like a crisis, for my family, like for my mom. She was not comfortable with it. And I just kind of didn't talk about it
Mhm.
until I was 21 again, even though I knew that I was, I didn't have the word queer, but
Mhm.
bi. Um, so trans people were there in my understanding of the world early on.
Mhm.
And, I remember thinking, am I attracted to this person because they look like a man? And then I asked myself, I didn't have the word cis, but I was like, if this were a man, aka cis man, would I be attracted to this person as a cis man? And my answer was no. So I was
Yeah.
like, well, something I'm attracted to here is the fact that I know it's not a cis man.
Mhm.
Um, and I did not register the person as necessarily butch. I registered the person as, didn't say trans, but as trans,
Yeah.
so even if the word trans isn't there, trans people are there, right? So and even if I didn't have the language, I knew trans people. We all know trans people. I learned the other day that my grandmother has known trans people for most of her life, and that my grandfather collaborated with a trans person that organized events. And it only came up because I told her about a trans woman that works for the Alcaldía Mayagüez, Teddy Dean's very well-known trans person. And she was like, yeah, I know her. And then I also know this other person. And I was in shock because we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was kind of like, well, obviously, my grandmother knew trans people, obviously, but it is frustrating sometimes to be like, if we all know trans people, we all have trans people in our lives since forever. Like, why didn't you talk about it?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Um, Speaking of which, can we talk about the cover art and these amazing illustrations? So, I mean, you talk about centaurs in the book. There's an adjective of centaurian. Um, they're wearing a zapatista mask, which then appears over here.
We're not wearing a zapatista mask.
It's not
So
zapatista. What is
no, no,
it?
no, no. You know
Yeah.
what it is
Hmm.
here? I know everyone's gonna assume that, and I'm fine with it. But here in
Yeah.
Puerto Rico, yeah, we knew it was gonna be read that way and like
Yeah.
embrace it, right? But here actually, like it's like a ski mask, one of these kind of like breathable ski masks that now like a lot of like young men use when they ride motorcycles. Like they wear these. It's a kind of
Uh-huh.
like a fad, and
Yeah.
it's like a thing they wear or when they ride horses. There go the centaur.
Uh-huh.
And Natalia incorporated that into her original drawing, which
Uh-huh.
is got other elements, is really beautiful. It's almost like a very common like Jibaro pastoral,
Yeah.
with the bohío in the
Yep.
background and the palm trees and all of this. And so of course the centaur in this
Mm.
context, which is in dialogue with a particular lineage of Puerto Rican visual history, it is a rewriting of that, right? Like I think of the poem El Valle de ¿Cómo es El Valle de Collores? I'm gonna send it to you.
Okay.
Collores is a poem by Luis Lloren Torres, and I'll send it to you. But it's like my grandmother like sang this and knew it by memory. It's a very common sort of
Mm.
like the jibaros coming down from the mountain type of poem, and
Thanks.
and yeah, so it really reminiscent of that, right? And of you know the moment in which there's a moment in the first canto in which Senex is crossing a river and it's sort of some like Centaurian, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, and does a lot of shape shifting early on. The way in which I talk about transness is similar to the
Yeah.
way that Noam Chomsky talks about language, right? Or that linguists in general talk about language, and that before the age of 12, you can acquire language, but after a certain age, you have to learn it because of the malleability of the brain. You know, when you're younger, you can just be exposed to a language and you acquire it, whereas when you're older, you have to actually learn it. So the way it operates in Angara is similar, right? So Synex is able to shapeshift up to a certain point, and then after a certain point, has to take tea and has to
Uh-huh.
do things. And so there's a moment in the text in which Synex regrets not having chosen a different form early on when he was able to shapeshift so easily. And because now he has to take tea and actually do all this work and do all this
Uh-huh.
stuff. But in that reflection, he's like, well, but if I couldn't have known, right? My journey was my journey, right? So
Yeah.
if I sure I would have chosen a different form, but only because I have the knowledge I have now. And so I had to go through that in order to gain this
Yeah.
knowledge. And now I have to do it the hard way, right?
Mm.
And it's kind of a reflection on transitioning as an older trans person. A lot of my friends are much younger. And their experience is different. And this is something I learned early is that, you know, the younger you are when you start on team, when you start on the HR team, when you do these changes, you know, the easier it actually is.
Mm.
And kind of like to shape your body and change your body. And the older you get, the more settled your body is into certain
Mm.
things, which is why there's such a strong fight for young people to have access to gender affirming care.
Right.
But of course, you know, my journey was different. My journey was that I started figuring this out in my 30s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, that's really interesting. I'm still thinking about what you said about treating the experience of transitioning is similar to the way that Chomsky talks about language. That's really well, I really thought this was a Zapatista mask, so now I know.
Yeah, we knew it was going to be read that way. Welcome that reading
And
of it.
like the red cover
Yeah,
and
yeah.
like yeah,
And
yeah.
Vasquez O'Neill created the design. So you know, I don't know how he read it. I don't know how he interpreted that mask. It's very probable
Right.
he saw it as a Zapatista mask, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm fine with that as a reading, right? But I wanted to insert this other idea of sort of like it also having this other symbolic, you know, kind of like kind of in like a street culture where
Yeah.
it's illegal.
Yeah. For self-protection when you're going really fast. Yeah.
And
Well,
people,
okay, so funny, like awkward
you know,
segue. Awkward segue. Can we talk about Walgreens as our last topic?
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So in your book, the mythical labyrinth is, of course, Walgreens reimagined or Walgreen. And you provide a map, which may or may not help the reader in finding their way through the labyrinth. And I think maybe you told me this, and then I Googled it, that there's like the greatest concentration of Walgreens in Puerto Rico of any place. Is that right?
Yes, it is the highest percentage per square foot, I believe. Yeah, than anywhere else. Yes, that's
Remarkable. So, with that in mind, can you just tell me a little bit about why you decided to set the labyrinth there? I mean, you make an amazing, amazing set of cantos from
did you
it.
get the chance when you visited with Daniel to go to Walgreens?
I have been in some, I think I sent you some photos I took of greeting card that I saw actually.
It's different here,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
they're bigger and they're more like a labyrinth. They're also slightly different laws. There was a time, I think it still operates in some place, I don't even know, where certain aisles were closed off on Sundays, and it was a law that was meant to protect small businesses and small
Mm,
pharmacies. So that those goods you could not buy at Walgreens on like Sundays, you'd have to go to
yeah.
a small pharmacy. I feel like every time I go, I mean, they're really big. They definitely carry different products.
Yeah.
Um, just as like people say that Burger King here tastes better, it does taste better. It's because the bread and the meat and stuff is from here, and the ingredients and some of the things are changed to like a local market. Doesn't mean that it's not a big company, right? It doesn't mean
Yeah.
that they're not evil, but definitely like in order to even sell, they have to like cater to the palate of Puerto Ricans. And the same goes for these Walgreens, which is just a chain store, and it's obviously about consumerism and neoliberalism as it kind of took shape in the 80s and the 90s in Puerto Rico and our current crisis and all of that. But I had a partner when I was in the US that would always make fun of me because I would want to go for fun to the Walgreens. And they'd be like, why? Why would you want to go to the Walgreens for fun? And it was just really, they said they didn't understand until they came to Puerto Rico, like that people do actually kind of go to Walgreens, like not just to shop, but just kind of like browse or peruse or get their different needs met, and it is kind of like labyrinthian in this way. Like my grandmothers for many years have bought perfume gifts for Christmas at Walgreens for me, ergo the perfume counter is very important
Yeah.
in a particular section. And of course for me the core and the primary element is the pharmacy, right,
Mm.
in the center, which is where Sinex is going to get his medication, and where I get my medication, and where a lot of people get their medication, right, here in Puerto Rico. And so, kind of like the center of the labyrinth being this pharmacy, especially since the reason for putting the pharmacy in the back is that you have to go through all these aisles and look at things and buy shit you
I
don't,
think.
right? It's very planned, it's very constructed with the purpose of getting you to buy crap, right? um and so, you know there historically in our literature, the traffic jam has been a primary metaphor.
Yeah.
um you know uh, the Juan Helpi talks about the notion of this being stuck, and that idea of being sick or stuck, in La
Mhm.
Charca, it's this pool or puddle of water that's not moving, that's stuck.
Mhm.
In La Guaracha and Macho Camacho, it's the
Yeah.
traffic jam, right? It's this
Uh,
kind of not moving, the sense of colonial subjectivity being stuck. And um for me, it's certainly the Walgreens is an analogy for the kind of labyrinthianness of having to navigate the world as a trans person, and just sort of, you know, find your just doing a daily task becomes so complicated, and you
mm,
have to think
mhm.
about, always have to think about what is it, like what how I'm going to do this as a trans person, right? And also, there's this element of all the people that Sinex meets and all the characters that Sinex meets, kind of like
Yeah.
that I modeled a lot after El Principito, the Little Prince, right? It's like traveling and meeting all these people, these characters,
Uh-huh.
right? In the labyrinth, and they're all essentially characters that are really either have become stuck in a way on an idea or fixated on a notion. Maybe they're trans and they stopped transitioning, right? Because someone said something once, or they got stuck on an idea, or they kind of got trapped in their own minds, and so it's also like the mind itself.
Yeah.
Or, circumstances they can't control. Some of them are like figures that inspired, like Bess. Just sort of essentially, or people stuck in their own transphobia, and just kind of people that um have internalized transphobia and don't know it, and have become
Mm.
actual active transphobes and develop like a paranoia around trans people, like transvestigators. And so this kind of idea that Sinex is learning about the world through this labyrinth, more about the world, but also learning about how complicated, transphobia and a trans exclusionary world is, and the characters in it are people.
Yeah.
They're people who are trapped in this kind of labyrinth of a
Mhm.
social labyrinth, but a labyrinth of their own creation as well. And so not only does the next have to move past them, navigate them, and just kind of survive that, but in order to get what he needs, right? But he has to avoid getting stuck in it,
Yeah.
another reference point there is the never ending story, right? The swamps of sadness.
Yeah.
Like he has to figure out that he needs to move past this and he can't get stuck in these aisles, and he has to reach the center of the labyrinth in order to leave. And of course, the irony of it all is that the labyrinth is something he chooses to enter knowing it's a labyrinth,
Mhm.
right? Because he's seeking something and he doesn't
Right.
know what it is. And he has to go through that process in order to understand what it is he's seeking.
That was amazing, that answer. Thank you. That was really beautiful. Um, um, yeah, so many dimensions to this. Um, I think we've reached the end of our time, but I would like to say to be continued. I hope we'll keep talking about this. Thank you so much for being so generous with your answers and your thinking and your time, and at a hectic moment for you.
Oh, it's such a good opportunity to talk about the book. I really appreciate it. Sometimes I forget I wrote this thing and then it's coming out, and I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's coming out August, pub date, mid-August,
September 2nd.
September 2nd. Yeah.
Um,
So exciting. So exciting. Congratulations. Yeah, I can't wait for it to be in the world.
so
Such a pleasure to talk to you about it.
thank you
Um,
for taking the time, and yeah,
or-
let me know if you need anything else from me.
Thank you. I will pause the recording.